Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I'm going to talk to you about 3 cars that were so poorly conceived that they managed to bankrupt their makers. One was a hypercar which was an absolute favourite in the top trumps of the 80s. One is an example of French lunacy. One was actually funded through lawsuits, and believe it or not, one managed to bankrupt not just one but 2 manufacturers. How is that possible? Stick around and find out. And at the end of the video there is a bonus bankruptcy car which I think is possibly the ugliest car in the world. The first of our 3 cars is also the oldest, and it is a prime example of just how crazy the French can be when it comes to car design. Now you may think that rotary engines were the preserve of Mazda, but in actual fact NSU, now Audi, also made one in the 70s, and even more obscurely, so did Citroen. This is the Citroen GS Birota. The standard GS was actually a brilliant car. It came out in 1970 and it ran for 16 years till 1986. It was a visionary, sort of quite futuristic design. And if you compare to what was around at the time, for example, the Austin Allegro, it must have seemed like a spaceship. It was incredibly aerodynamic, so it had a CD of just 0.31. That compares with similar cars at the time that had things like 0.45. And even the Ford Sierra, which was released to huge fanfare about how aerodynamic it was, only had 0.35. It also had hydropneumatic suspension, which made for an incredibly smooth ride, and it had some purpose-built flat-4 engines that were really revvy and really worked well with the car. That, however, wasn't enough for Citroen, who decided that they needed a range-topping version. They thought that the Wankel engine would make the perfect partner. These engines are known for their smooth power delivery, so you can imagine how well that would have worked with that luxurious ride offered by the hydropneumatic suspension. On top of which, compared to the power output, the displacement on rotary engines is actually very low. So that would have worked very well with the sort of French tax rules of the time. The Birota was released in 1973, but immediately it was apparent it was going to face some really big hurdles. First of all, it was a full 70% more expensive than the normal GS. Not only that, but it was more expensive still than the larger and more powerful Citroen DS, which was their own range topper. It was also released during the 1973 oil crisis, and that was an incredibly important thing, and this is why. The Birota did have almost twice the power of the normal version. So the normal GS, I think it was a 1.3, that had 55 horsepower. The Birota had 105 horsepower, but it actually had woeful fuel economy of 14 miles to the gallon. Relative to the power output, you can see how thirsty it was, and what a hard sell it was at a time when petrol prices were spiking. So you can understand why Citroen really struggled to sell them. They got up to, I think, 147 units in the first year, and then they decided to can the project. Not just that, but they bought back as many of them as they could because they didn't want to have to offer support in the future. In 1973, following this debacle, Citroen went bankrupt and were forced to be rescued by Peugeot. Our next car is the Vector, a car that was financed through lawsuits and that was an absolute top trumps hero. Now I remember when I was a kid at school and we all used to love top trumps, and the car ones in particular were just awesome. And there were some obvious cars in there. There was like the Ferraris, for example, had high power, the 4x4s were heavy. But there was one car in there which was absolutely astounding because no one had ever heard of it, and yet it was possibly the toppest trump of them all. And that was the Vector WA. So in terms of price, but also in terms of power, it completely topped everything else, and it was a weird looking shark-like thing. Anyway, the Americans had long craved to have their own proper supercar. And it had been quite a long time coming. The Corvettes were always there, but they weren't really quite supercar level. Vector was formed, or released, actually it wasn't formed, it released the proper first production car, the W8, in 1989. It used a twin-turbo Chevrolet small block V8, pumping out a pretty incredible for the time 625 horsepower. Even more incredible was that the gearbox was a 3-speed slush box, an automatic. Now, another oddity about this car was that the financing for it was actually largely made through lawsuits that Gerald Viger, who ran the company, took out against Goodyear and a brand of cigarettes. So against Goodyear there was some trademark infringement to do with Vector tyres. But anyway, quite an odd way to sort of finance a company. And it may be a portent of things to come. The W8, however, isn't the car that finished off Vector. That would be the M12, a car that came afterwards. Now, by this stage, Vector had already changed hands a couple of times, and it was owned by a consortium in Malaysia that also controlled Lamborghini. When the new car was planned, it was decided that it should use the Lamborghini V12 engine, I guess as a way of saving money. However, there was a huge problem with that. This is supposed to be the one and only all-American supercar, and you're going to put a Lamborghini Italian V12 in it. Doesn't make much sense. And on top of that, the Lambo V12 produced less power than the American twin-turbo V8 that was in the original car. Vector were also once again in financial difficulties, and it's reported that they had to pay Lamborghini for some of their later engines with complete M12 cars. In short, this was a complete flop. The all-American supercar that the public were promised was actually half Italian, with a chassis I think designed by some ex-Lotus employees, and as a result it was a total failure. 2 years later the company went bankrupt. Our next car is one that has the incredible distinction of having made not one manufacturer bankrupt, but 2 manufacturers bankrupt. This is the DeLorean. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the history because it's incredibly sordid and complex, but it is important to understand that what was originally promised was a car that was going to be really good value, about $13,000. It was going to be mid-engined, it was going to have a composite chassis, and it was going to have a lightweight rotary engine. What was actually delivered was rear-engined, it had an old-fashioned steel spine chassis, and the V6 engine that it used was heavy and very low on power. Because of the high price and because it didn't really drive all that well, it soon sent DeLorean into receivership. But even more interesting, it had a direct effect on another car company, and that was Lotus. Why did it affect Lotus? Well, there were several reasons, but Colin Chapman, who ran Lotus at the time, was heavily involved in the development of the DeLorean, especially the chassis side of things, but also he had had some questionable dealings with John DeLorean himself, with some money that the British government had pumped into the company in order to help it keep afloat. The British government, I think, had paid about £84 million, I think this was in 1982, to help DeLorean get set up. When it went bankrupt, that money had just sort of disappeared, and it was rumoured that some of it had gone through unusual routes, both for John DeLorean and Colin Chapman. Now, Colin Chapman died that same year, and he left Lotus in a real predicament because the Inland Revenue in the UK put a protective order on Lotus of £84 million. That made it incredibly difficult for them to conduct any business. In the end, David Wicks from British Car Auctions rescued the company. He got to an agreement with Inland Revenue, he managed to get some investment, and from then on Lotus managed to move forward. Now, I have driven a DeLorean, and I have to say that although it was a flop in some ways and perhaps it wasn't the best handling thing, the engine was a little bit underpowered, it is actually a really interesting car and one that quite got under my skin. So if you're interested, have a look. I'll put in the pinned comment a link to the video for that car. Now we come to our bonus car, and this one is a real doozy. This is the Weber Fast One, and I believe probably the world's ugliest car. In 1988, Roman Weber finished his apprenticeship as a toolmaker, and by the late 90s, he had a very successful company providing high-tech components for Formula One teams. He then formed a subsidiary, Weber Automotive, which was actually due to produce the world's fastest car. That was its main purpose. Launched in 2007 at the Top Marks show in Monaco, the Weber Fast One was actually a spotter's delight. In terms of figures, it was pretty incredible. It had a twin-turbo Chevrolet 7-litre V8 claimed to be producing in excess of 900 horsepower. It was four-wheel drive. It had 4 fuel tanks with 110 litres. 4 fuel tanks for apparently the best sort of weight distribution and aerodynamics. 110 litres, can you imagine to fill that up now? Would be about 220 pounds. The fast one was supposedly capable of 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds and an incredible top speed of 250 miles an hour, which would have made it the fastest car at the time. It was also, for me, without doubt, one of the ugliest cars of all time. I mean, just take a look at this thing. It is just... I don't think you could have made it uglier if you tried. I mean, it had some really incredible stuff on it, including 12 piston calipers. But unsurprisingly, only one was made and then the company went under. As such, we can't really prove those figures. They were never tested in terms of top speed, 0 to 60, all that kind of stuff. But still, what an utterly weird car. What do you think? Is this the ugliest car you have ever seen? And also, do you know of any other cars that were responsible for their makers sort of collapsing? I've done as much research as possible, but I'm sure I've probably missed some. So far, we have only spoken about cars that made the manufacturers bankrupt, but what about cars that made their owners bankrupt? Well, I have some personal experience in this because I bought a really cheap Ferrari 308 blind at auction about 2 years ago, and predictably, it has had a never-ending stream of problems and has never run properly in my tenure. If you want to find out more about my Ferrari 308, the Influenzo, then here is a link to the full playlist. I'm shortly going to be doing a video of all the costs that have gone into that car in 2 years up till now, and you won't believe that. So if you want to make sure you don't miss that, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, it is hugely appreciated. If you need to contact me, then Instagram is the best way, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.